Nós vamos dar início agora à sessão denominada Geografia e a Crise Financeira. Na verdade, essa sessão ela é um desdobramento de uma primeira sessão que nós tivemos aqui no último encontro de Diamantina, onde foi feita uma sessão sobre moeda e território como um todo. É uma sessão na qual participaram o Gary, que está aqui de novo, a professora Sheila Dó, da Universidade de Stirling, o professor Carlos Fuentes, da Universidade de La Laguna, que é um coautor muito importante da professora Sheila Dó. Isso faz parte de uma tentativa, né, que nós estamos tendo do CDPLAR, especificamente do grupo de pesquisa do Lente, né, do Laboratório de Estudo de Moeda e Território, em tentar estabelecer um pouco conexões com os pesquisadores internacionais, e esse é parte do movimento de tentativa de não só estabelecer contato para pesquisa, mas também estabelecer contato para diálogos mais constantes com os pesquisadores. Naquele momento, eu vou fazer uma breve introdução, naquele momento, aquela discussão foi um pouco sobre fundamentos da teoria sobre moeda e território, né, porque era uma primeira mesa que nós estávamos tratando. Né. Nesse momento de hoje, que nós vamos dar continuidade àquela discussão, trazendo alguns desdobramentos e algumas pesquisas mais aplicadas nesse sentido, contextualizando claramente na crise mundial. Eu lembro que naquela mesa eu comentei, e aqui eu vou começar fazendo abertura, fazendo uma provocação para os debatedores. Eu lembro que naquela mesa eu comentei que era 2008, fazia 9 anos que o Ron Martin tinha publicado um livro, Money and Space, que naquele livro ele tem uma frase que ele falava que a geografia das finanças e da moeda já tinha se desenvolvido tanto durante os anos 80 e 90, que naquele momento poderia-se dizer que existia uma nova subdisciplina no campo da geografia e da economia regional. De fato, se vocês observarem os trabalhos sobre moeda e território, basicamente você tem, a partir de 80, um grande revival desse tema, com vários autores publicando e investigando impactos e as relações entre moeda e território. Né? No entanto, e aqui vai a minha provocação, né, apesar do Ron Martin ter falado em 1999 que já era uma nova subdisciplina, se você for observar, e eu falava isso em 2008, se você for observar a trajetória de crescimento dessa nova subdisciplina, nos anos 2000, ela não tem a mesma velocidade ou o mesmo vigor que tinha na década de 90. Quer dizer, os grupos de pesquisa, basicamente, que no início dos anos 2000 se estabeleceram, praticamente se mantiveram os mesmos. De uma forma mais, quer dizer, explícitas, você vê, por exemplo, poucos cursos de economia regional ou de geografia, na qual você tem cursos de moeda e território, geografia das finanças. Ou seja, de uma determinada forma, eu acho que essa nova subdisciplina ainda não conseguiu, no ano 2000, se tornar um elemento inerente à geografia, conseguiu transformar a moeda como um elemento inerente à geografia e economia regional, da mesma forma que a tecnologia, recursos e outras variáveis. Então, e isso é importante, me chamou muita atenção ano passado, quando eu estive na Conferência Mundial da Regional Studies Association. E naquela conferência me chamou muita atenção porque existia cerca de 330 trabalhos sendo apresentados. O Filipe estava lá, inclusive. E naquela conferência havia apenas 3 trabalhos sobre moeda ou sobre finanças de uma forma geral, né, em cerca de 330 trabalhos. Isso 2 eram meus, né, e um do Leslie Budd, quer dizer, era uma... Inclusive, a sessão foi muito engraçada, que os dois trabalhos na mesma sessão eram o meu. Eu saí e voltei para a mesa para apresentar. Mas, de qualquer forma, chama atenção para isto, quer dizer, é uma provocação que falo. Por que, de fato, apesar do vigor como essa agenda de pesquisa tem no início dos anos 80, 90 e inicia os anos 2000, por que ela estabiliza? E eu acho que o nome de estabilização é esse. Os grupos de pesquisa, basicamente, se mantêm o mesmo. Eu tenho algumas variáveis, algumas hipóteses, que eu vou colocar aqui, depois a gente pode explorar. Mas eu tenho algumas hipóteses que estão ligadas ao conceito de moeda que tanto economistas regionais quanto geógrafos têm utilizado. Quer dizer, um conceito de moeda, uma forma de abordar a moeda que bebe muito, principalmente os economistas regionais, em falhas de mercado, moeda como elemento capaz de suprir falha de mercado, sistema financeiro como elemento capaz de suprir assimetrias de informação e custos de transação, que é proveniente da literatura novo-keynesiana. Eu tenho minhas dúvidas se essa concepção de moeda é capaz de fazer com que a moeda seja um elemento central para o economista. Porque se a falha de mercado, uma vez que você corrige a falha, ela não tem mais necessidade. Então, eu acho que essa concepção de moeda, eu acho que ainda é muito forte entre os geógrafos, ela é importante para explicar esse quadro. Agora, com o advindo da crise econômica mundial, novamente, a questão da geografia e das finanças foi colocada na pauta. Então, nós estamos aqui de frente de uma nova oportunidade para, de novo, tentar dar um maior fôlego a essa linha de investigação e a tentar, de forma mais constante, né, introduzir a moeda como um elemento central na investigação de economia regional e na investigação de geografia econômica. E essa mesa é um pouco uma tentativa nesse sentido. A gente está aqui para discutir geografia e a crise mundial. Para isso, nós convidamos a professora Jane Pollard, da Universidade de Newcastle. Ela tem sua área de especialização na geografia das finanças e da moeda, né, com artigos publicados Ela é uma das poucas que tem um curso de geografia de moeda e geografia da moeda, é um dos poucos cursos que eu achei na internet, nas escolas de geografia, com curso específico de moeda e geografia de moeda e finanças, autora de vários artigos e publicados na Uber Studies, Cambridge Journal of Economics, se não me engano, Journal of Economic Geography, entre outros. O Andrew Leishon, que era outro convidado, infelizmente não pôde vir. Aliás, diga de passagem, eu agradeço muito pessoalmente a Jane por ter vindo, porque essa data de seminário não é propício para quem está fora, porque é período de aula e período de prova. A Jane disse que ela nunca corrigiu tão rapidamente as provas dela, que ela teve que dar as notas antes para poder vir. Isso é até uma bênção, né? Teve que se livrar logo das provas. O Leishon cancelou em cima da hora, semana passada, se não me engano, por motivos de trabalho também, que ele está coisa. E o Gary está aqui de novo. O Gary está se tornando um dos grandes amigos do seminário do CEDEPLAR. O Gary é a terceira vez que ele está com a gente em Belo Horizonte e aqui. Da vez passada, ele participou do seminário e deu um curso de uma semana. Dessa vez, o Gary está no Brasil como professor, através do programa Professor Visitante Estrangeiro do CNPq, vai ficar aqui 5 meses com a gente, não só participando desse evento, mas dando cursos e numa network com a UFRJ e a UF. Né? E o Gary é um grande amigo que eu acho que a casa, para usar um termo que o João não usa muito, os grandes amigos do CEDEPLAR, quer dizer, o Gary está se tornando um grande amigo do CEDEPLAR, ao ponto dessa mesa toda, praticamente, ele fez a intermediação com a Jane e com o Leishon, ao ponto de ele é que deu as dicas, como é que é a diamantina, se vai ter frio, se não vai, não se preocupe que cachaça é igual água em Minas Gerais, todas as dicas foram dadas pelo Gary. Eu estava ocupado lá com meus trabalhos trabalho, ele falou, deixa eu assumir isso aqui. Ele foi lá e ele organizou, inclusive, não, pode ir informal, não tem problema, você pode levar um casaco se você quiser para a apresentação, mas se durante o seminário, se você tiver de bermuda, uma sandália, uma camisa, você vai estar no espírito de Diamantina, não tem problema, lá vai ser muito informal. O que mostra o quanto que o Gary, e aqui eu faço um agradecimento público pelo esforço dele em ajudar a gente. Bom, feita essa introdução, vamos começar primeiro com a professora Jane. Jane.
Okay, thank you. Okay. What I would like to do today is talk a little bit about the geography of financial crisis in the United Kingdom, and I'll be talking about some work I've been doing with an interdisciplinary group of colleagues at Newcastle who are in law, in business, and in economic geography. And I must first start with an apology. People from England, as you know, are very, very bad at learning second languages, so I have little bits of French and Spanish and Italian, but no Portuguese, alas. So I will speak in English, and I will try and speak slowly and hope people can keep up with me. What I want to do today is basically sort of three main things. I'm going to be talking about the collapse of Northern Rock, which was the fifth largest bank in the United Kingdom. And before I do that, I'm going to, for those of you who are less familiar with Newcastle and the northeast of England, I'll provide some context about the region and its economic history. And then I'm going to give you the sort of a very brief story of actually what happened at Northern Rock, a sort of timeline of the events that led to its failure in 2008. So I'll talk about its roots as a building society, which converted to a bank, and then got into trouble with the financial problems of 2007. And then there are many geographies around Northern Rock that we could talk about. What I will do today is talk about three of the geographies that me and my colleagues have become interested in. The first talks about some of the regional class elites that have traditionally governed Northern Rock. The second thing I'll talk about there is the business model of Northern Rock, which was very much premised on the sort of peripherality of Newcastle as a place in the United Kingdom. You know, Newcastle is not a large financial centre. Thirdly, I'll report on some of the work we did for the Regional Development Agency with colleagues at Durham University in the United Kingdom that looked at the impact of Northern Rock's difficulties in terms of gross value added in the regional economy and in terms of redundancies for employees of Northern Rock. And then I'll just, by concluding, make a few points there. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background about the northeast and the location of Northern Rock. The northeast is, if we include sort of Newcastle and Durham, it's probably got about just over 1.5 million people. It has a history of being reliant on heavy industry. It was a place of shipbuilding, mining, steel production, those kinds of industries. And like many parts of Britain, those industries suffered with deindustrialisation during the 1980s and the very major recession we had of the 1980s. What we have seen since then is that the northeast is extremely reliant on the public sector for employment creation. So the universities, the hospitals, other forms of education, social services, civil servants, all kinds of administrative jobs related to central government have been moved to the northeast, and they have become the major sources of employment creation, certainly since through the 1990s. More recently, we've seen the kinds of development we've seen around the northeast has been the growth of tourism, leisure services, the building of very large shopping malls, and trying to encourage consumption through those kinds of things. In terms of gross value added, the northeast region, the top right-hand corner, it is a region that produces is of low value added. It is not a rich region. It is not a particularly productive region compared to, say, London and the southeast. If we look at productivity of gross value added per hour worked, nearly, and on the left-hand axis, if we have percentage of employment, again you can see the northeast has a relatively low employment rate and relatively low productivity. So you can start to get this image of a low wage, relatively low productivity region. We can also see differences in gross value added within regions. Again, if we just focus on the northeast, you can see that Newcastle has slightly higher levels of gross value added than the rest of Northumberland, which is very rural. It is agricultural, farming terrain with, again, very low, relatively low rates in a UK context of gross value added. If we move to things like the start-up of new enterprises, we collect these statistics in the UK about how many new firms are started that are of a sufficient size to pay value-added tax or VAT. Again, the story is of the northeast as being underperforming. It is not deemed to be an innovative region that is producing a lot of new businesses. If we talk about labour market skills, again we have a similar picture. The northeast will be performing below the English average in terms of its proportion of population that have a certain grade of qualifications. And if we look again at some of the recent changes in unemployment in the United Kingdom, with the impact of the credit crunch, we see the northeast, the blue line is the unemployment rate, the northeast, the lighter blue line is the change in unemployment, and you can see the northeast has again suffered very badly in the contemporary credit crunch. So we have a picture then built up of a region which has traditionally suffered since the 1980s with unemployment. It's a relatively low producing, low skill environment. And that is very much the context in which I want to talk about what happened at Northern Rock and its failure in 2008. So Northern Rock was formed in 1965, and it was the amalgamation of two mutually owned building societies. And when I say a building society in England, they were owned by their members. They were relatively small savings institutions that made mortgage loans. So they had savings accounts that would be rechanneled for funding mortgages. So in 1965, we had the Northern Counties and the Rock Building Society come together to form Northern Rock. And in 1997, given the deregulation of the building societies, Northern Rock lost its mutual status and chose instead to become a bank so that it could leverage more of its money, it could find more money on international wholesale markets. So becoming a bank was for Northern Rock a vehicle to expansion. They could raise more money on international capital markets. And they had a very aggressive policy of growth. Northern Rock, they spent a lot of money on advertising. You could open your newspaper and there would be adverts about Northern Rock. If you were looking for financial press, would produce tables of the most competitive mortgages, and Northern Rock would always be in those tables with some very competitively priced mortgages. So up to 2007, Northern Rock grew very rapidly. It became the fifth largest UK lender. grew to having over 6,000 employees and over £100 billion worth of assets. And to cut a long story short, what happened in 2007 was Northern Rock had to approach the Bank of England for emergency funding when international wholesale markets, the interbank market, dried up, and Northern Rock was unable, had a liquidity crisis and was unable to roll over its loans. So in September 2007, Northern Rock had to ask the Bank of England for support, which caused a huge scare and sort of very much set the scene for the credit crunch in the UK. In 2008, in February, Northern Rock was nationalised. It was taken over by the government. And a business plan was put in place throughout the rest of 2008 to try and return it to the private sector. We saw redundancies, which I will talk about a little later. And the latest plan, if we bring this up to date into 2010, then the plans now have been to split Northern Rock into two separate entities. They're both at the moment still owned by the government, but one will become Northern Rock, a public limited company which will make loans, give mortgages. The other will be an asset management group that will be operated by the government to try and get rid of the old debts, the old mortgage book of Northern Rock. And we still have, as of April 2010, there are still legal cases from shareholders in Northern Rock whose shares were valued at nothing, at zero, when taken over by the government. They are still now going through European courts to try and get compensation for their lack of, for the fact their shares are now worthless. So if we have a quick look at what happened to Northern Rock's profits, Northern Rock kept industry analysts very happy for many years up until 2006. You can see there what happened to their profits in 2007, and they've particularly deteriorated in 2008 and 2009. This graph shows you the share price, the value of the stock of Northern Rock, and what happened to that from May 2007 when rumours started circulating that Northern Rock were having difficulty in securing money from for the international markets. And what we had with Northern Rock was the first bank run in England or in the UK since 1866, when the BBC had these pictures. The BBC's financial editor, a man called Robert Peston, broke the story that Northern Rock had approached the Bank of England for a loan, and very quickly the television cameras were out on the streets of Newcastle filming people queuing up at the bank, and images like these caused panic for savers and mortgage holders in the UK, who then were going on the website or queuing up to try and withdraw their money. So this was a scene that we haven't seen for a very, very long time in the UK, and it frightened people and made them think that what was going on was something very much out of the ordinary, and was ushering in a period where we had a great deal to worry about. Okay, so if we think of that is the sort of context about the North East and some of the sort of basic facts about Northern Rock's growth and its turn to the Bank of England for funds in 2008. If we talk about some of the geographies around Northern Rock and what makes it interesting, and going back to some of the comments that Marco was making about the relationship between geography and finance. The first sort of linkages I want to talk about between geography and finance here talks about the governance base of Northern Rock, who was actually running it and where they came from. So when Northern Rock, as I said, was formed by the merger of these two very different institutions in 1965, the Northern Counties Building Society was one of the sort of aristocratic established institutions in Newcastle's sort of economic history. And the first chief executive officer, the first head of the new Northern Rock, a man called Richard Osborne, he was a major political figure in the affairs of the northeast of England. And he saw Northern Rock as a vehicle through which he could exercise this kind of influence. Aris, who has written a book about the Northern Rock problems, had argued that the merger of the Rock Building Society and Northern Counties was this merger of the cavaliers of the local aristocracy and the roundheads of the local bourgeoisie, that it was these two quite different groups coming together who sort of struck this deal that Northern Rock would be governed by the local aristocracy. And we have here a picture of Matthew Ridley, who is the Ridley family, are very, very powerful in the northeast. They have positions on the boards of many of the northeast's major companies. So the chairmanship was assumed by the sort of local aristocracy. The senior executives of the firm, though, who actually ran it, came from the old mutual building society background. They had very little experience in the banking industry per se. They came from this mutual cooperative background and had relatively little commercial experience. So the man on the left, Adam Applegarth, he was the former chief executive officer. He actually ran Northern Rock, and much has been made in the media about his relative lack of qualifications. He used to be a cashier at Northern Rock, and he rose through the ranks to run the place, and has been portrayed as this person who basically wasn't qualified to fill this role. Now, Adam Applegarth was very popular for a few years with the City of London. He was seen as this dynamic young entrepreneur, and he went to the city and to the financial media, and he told them about this fantastic business model that he had engineered in the northeast. And it was a unique, successful business model to be this low-cost mortgage bank and to have a virtuous circle of cost control, competitive products, high asset quality, and relying on volume of business and narrow margins. So he was very much taken up by the financial media in the City of London and seen as this dynamic, entrepreneurial young thing from the periphery. One of the second geography of Northern Rock we want to talk about, though, is precisely the way in which this notion that the northeast is not a financial centre, how that was woven into understandings of how Northern Rock did business. And the way that Northern Rock set themselves up, they were very, very conscious about the importance of geography and how their geographical location could be perceived as a disadvantage. So here we've got Aris talking about the dilemma that Northern Rock face. They're a northeastern business society, and yet the most buoyant housing markets are in the southeast around London. So how could they get into those markets? What we saw then with Northern Rock was they worked very hard to put together this originate and distribute model of mortgages through securitisation. They worked very hard on their telephone call centres, on their websites. They worked to be able to do mortgages at a distance, remotely, for very low cost. And to do that as well, they were relatively unusual in that they relied for 75% of their funding not from retail depositors, but from those international wholesale markets. They relied on cheap money from wholesale markets, which they had to keep turning over very quickly to fund their mortgage model. And this is a quote that is taken from Northern Rock's own literature on their website, where again they talk about the importance of the geography and how they overcame, how this business model overcame the perceived disadvantages of trying to do mortgages from the northeast of England. And they write about themselves that the parallel is to think of a highly efficient manufacturing company. This is how Northern Rock has been able to grow so quickly. It's efficient, well managed, and has lower costs than its rivals, and is therefore able to lend money to borrowers at a relatively low interest rate. It goes on, Northern Rock claimed they had the lowest cost producers base in the banking industry in Europe, and the key advantage over their rivals was their head office and key operational units located in the northeast, where wages are on average lower than the rest of the UK. So Northern Rock, in their publicity, in their literature, they drew on their peripheral location to say, look, this gives us competitive advantage. We work in a low-wage region, and we're a region that is traditionally associated with manufacturing, not with finance. Well, Northern Rock was saying, we are a manufacturer of mortgages. We are making mortgages in the same way that we used to make other commodities, and we do it in high volume with relatively low wages and low prices. They were sort of playing on that traditional role of the northeast. So they were very happy to portray themselves as this low-cost location, and very much that this was a peculiarly northeast way of doing finance, that grew on and interacted with their previous rounds of peripherality. Okay, so that's said a few words about the governance of Northern Rock and the business, the sort of peculiar business model of Northern Rock. What I want to do now is say a little about a third geography we can think of here, which is the geography of the impact of Northern Rock's problems. And here I'm drawing on work that's been done with colleagues not only in geography, business and law at Newcastle University, but also some colleagues in the business school at Durham. And what they did was estimate the gross value added implications of Northern Rock's problems, and they've estimated that there was a loss of about £800 million to the regional economy, which is about 2% of the regional total. And they calculated that in looking at direct, indirect, and induced effects of spending. In terms of employment loss, they've estimated a total of 2,500, which again comes from these three categories: direct, indirect, and induced. In terms of direct job losses, there were about 1,900 people who were made redundant, and most of those were compulsory redundancies. Some people elected to take early retirement, but most of them were compulsory redundancies. So if we look at the total employment for Northern Rock, you can see how it grew steadily through from 2001 to 2007, and then very quickly tailed off with those redundancies. And if we look at where people have been made redundant, then again we see a very familiar picture. Most of the redundancies at Northern Rock were people working in call centres and doing relatively low-grade clerical work. They were relatively low-paid workers in clerical grades, and they came from some of the most deprived areas in Sunderland, just to the south of Newcastle, which is an area of traditionally high unemployment, where we're seeing now quite marked rises in unemployment, and also some of the areas around particularly northern parts of Newcastle. And in some of these areas, Northern Rock redundancies now will have added, 2 or 3% to people who are claiming unemployment insurance in each of those localities. What we also did was a telephone survey of the workers who had been made redundant. We did 3 surveys with them. The first survey was done in December 2008, when most of the workers were laid off in August 2008. So after 3 months, we looked at them and said, okay, how many of them are back in work? And there was about 49% were unemployed in 2008. By the third wave, that was down to 26%. If we look at those in employment, the numbers went from 33% in 2008 up to 57%. So the Regional Development Agency would say this is a relatively good outcome. The fact that, a year later, only 26% of people were unemployed, they would say, was a good result, particularly if you consider the labour market context is one of growing unemployment in the North East. We might have expected more people to still be unemployed. However, given the North East dependence on the public sector and the budget deficit that we now have after bailing out our banks, I think the reality is that the employment situation in the North East is going to deteriorate probably quite rapidly in the near future. The other thing that happened as a result of Northern Rock's failure was that the Northern Rock Foundation, which was a charity which contributed to all sorts of projects in the North East, that has taken a large hit in terms of its charitable donations, which again has had an impact on Northern Rock. We're very regionally embedded. They sponsored the local sports teams, they sponsored the football team, the basketball team, the local rugby team. They were major sponsors there. When they were struggling, those local sports teams started wearing these Rock Steady T-shirts. That is Michael Owen, who some of you may recognise, when Brazil beat England 2-1 in the 2002 World Cup. He scored our goal. So you won, so I can raise that in this company. But Michael Owen, who was he used to be the England centre forward, but he played for Newcastle United. He would come out wearing his Rock Steady T-shirt, and this was about encouraging people in the North East to not give up on Northern Rock, to keep putting their savings into the institution and to stick with this institution through the downturn. Philip Auger has an interesting sort of insight on Northern Rock because it has broader repercussions for how we think about this credit crisis and its repercussions, not just in the UK but elsewhere. And he was arguing that, had you been asked in the spring of 2007 to nominate one British company that summed up this, the sort of the Thatcherite ideal of this transformation from a manufacturing to a service-based economy, then you could have picked Northern Rock. You might have picked Northern Rock. And it started, originating as a self-help movement for artisans in the heavy industrial heartland of northeast England. It became this information technology-enabled finance house. It offered relatively well-paid jobs in modern air-conditioned offices. These were children and grandchildren of miners and shipyard workers who'd learned new skills as members of Britain's financial army. And this was the Northeast, demonstrating that it had moved on and was ready for the 21st century. You could have said that in 2007. The picture now, obviously, is looking very, very different. But there was then this image of Northern Rock as being very much this new cutting edge of the knowledge economy in the northeast of England, and they had this media coverage. They had very nice new headquarters in Gosforth in Newcastle. They were this icon of the sort of renewal of the Northeast. Let me just sum up then by saying, bringing out a few themes here, which I think will be interesting for the rest of the session. What we've been trying to do with this analysis of Northern Rock is provide an analysis of what went wrong, which very much looks at some of the regionally specific elements of what went on, and talk about the extent to which this can be seen as a very regionally grounded example of a financialised economy and what went wrong with it, and what happens, who loses when it does go wrong. So I talked there about the way that Northern Rock was governed. It was very much an institution of the Northeast. I talked about its business model, which again was always very self-conscious about its location in the Northeast. And of course the major impacts, which is for low-wage clerical workers, who predominantly women, who were laid off when those redundancies came through. What Northern Rock does, though, was, initially Northern Rock was portrayed as what we would call a rotten apple. It was one bad case where maybe it had been poorly managed and had suffered. What we saw, though, was that Northern Rock was just the first British institution to seek help from the taxpayer, that it wasn't just one rotten example, it was just the first domino in a series of institutions that failed, and therefore has broader resonance for what happens. One of the things that comes up, though, is that Northern Rock in many ways just reproduced this very dependent notion of industrialisation that we've had in the Northeast for a very long time. We saw through Northern Rock the limits of their peripherality, if you like, in trying to become a financial big player in the northeast of England. I think what their collapse also shows, though, was that for all this talk about the new economy and the knowledge economy, that actually that growth was very fragile and illusory, that this is no great turnaround, that Newcastle doesn't have this financial economy. And I think for regions particularly like the Northeast, it talks to broader debates that are now going on in the UK about why are we so dependent on financial services, and is that a good thing or not? The fact they are so concentrated. There is a debate now going on about the need to rebalance the UK economy, not only in terms of the sectors in which we specialise and do well, but also where the employment created by those sectors is to be found. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Now, thank you, Jane. Obrigado, Jane. Gary, 20 minutes, Gary. Okay. 20 minutes. Okay. Oh, you try that.
I'll try. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Jane, for a great presentation, and thank you, Sedapla and Marco, for creating these opportunities for me to be here and share ideas with you. My work here with people has been very important for my own intellectual growth in these several years, so it's really been a pleasure. I'm going to talk about the geography of the crisis, and maybe let's say the post-crisis crisis, with implications for Brazil. And we're going to go through some things. Here's the plan. I'm going to start actually with the point that I introduced, my main points from the presentation 2 years ago. And we'll just review that very quickly, because in some sense I then was making an appeal for a spatially aware geography. And in what we really had, spatially aware and focusing on power and so on, and what we have seen literally from the moment we left this space was the explosion, the further explosion of a financial crisis that became a global crisis that's become a Eurozone crisis. As Jane noted, it really was kicked off by the Northern Rock episode, but it's gone so much deeper. We'll then kind of review the situation in the world economy. Actually, my analysis here is pretty similar to the one that would have perhaps been given by Andrew Leishon had he been able to come. So I'll kind kind of give you one screen on Andrew's take on this with his colleagues, and then we're going to go through these kind of implications of these three evolving crises. The one is the crisis of governing power in finance. The second is the problem of the global macroeconomy. And the third is the collapse of the Eurozone. And then we'll take a real quick look at the implications for Brazil. So, basically, real quickly, understanding the economy is crucial. But in some sense, one of the themes of Sedaplar in approaching this is the idea that we have to surpass economists' own ideas to really get to some of the important points about the economy. And 2 points in particular stand out as really requiring critique. One is the idea that economists use an imaginary ideal equilibrium state as a reference point. We really have to get over that. And the second thing is that there's, as you know, this famous distinction between micro and macro. And actually, Jane is in a center that focuses on regional issues and urban issues, and Sedaplar itself is like that. So, what is it that's being missed? Well, instead of starting from imaginary equilibria, I would say we have to be sure to include space, time, and power and in our core models. Space, uneven levels of well-being and suffering, border imbalances, we talked about that a lot last time. And time here is fundamental. Of course, this has been a point that's really been deeply taken by contemporary Keynesian economics. And the problem of uncertainty, not probabilistic risk, being embedded in what goes on. And when we have uncertainty that becomes too severe, fear replaces conventional beliefs, and people run to safety, as they are now doing throughout the world's financial markets. With regard to power, we'll talk about this actually in speaking of finance. I just want to say, well, think of power several different ways. I think this thing will, we have the asymmetric ability of participants to leave. So if somebody can leave a relationship more easily than another, then that person is empowered, and the other person lacks power. And so, if you can go get another job as good as the job you have, then you have power in that employment relationship. If not, you do not, and you can be exploited. Secondly, this ability of people that are well positioned, especially we think of monopoly, to lock in extraordinary gains. And then the third kind of power I want to highlight is when one participant can impose losses on another. And, of course, this would be one, cruel example would be structural adjustment programs that have been imposed around the world. Another would be too big to fail. Okay, now let's go with this. Yeah. Okay. Now, instead of micro-macro, to take the other point, we have to think of structured spaces of interaction, and specifically, we want to think about areas. And I'll just be really brief here, just to say that, we have like local areas, kind of cities, or maybe vizinhos, something like that, neighborhoods. And then in addition, we have regions which maybe are interlinked local areas. Jane just gave us a great example as we took a look at Northeast England. In these areas, basically, it's obvious, they have thick, through-time structures that both create opportunities and restrict them, as Jane so well showed in her example of Northeast England. So in sum, understanding economic dynamics means understanding how people with different amounts of power deal with real-time decisions and complex structured interactions that include cross-border disequilibria. That, to me, is kind of the heart of the economics that we really need. And last time I gave this picture, and you can, if you were here 2 years ago, I won't elaborate, but we basically talked about how we can work at different scales, and we really shouldn't privilege one scale over another. All of these are active and interacting, and our understanding, unfortunately, has to encompass all of these things. Okay, let's go to the crisis in the world economy. Basically, what's happened since we all left Diamantina in early September 2008? Basically, the world kind of came apart more than ever. We had the subprime housing crisis that really, took off in the U.S. and then hit other parts of the globe. That turned into a full-bore financial crisis, including in September, October, later September, October, the failures of Lehman Brothers, which was called recently by Martin Wolf an LCFO. It's a term I kind of like. Large, complex financial organization. Washington Mutual, Wachovia, the seizures of AIG, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, all of that in those 2 amazing months. Then we roll right into a recession. Actually, the recession was ongoing. We found out about that. And now since we've seen a fast growth and recovery in China with stagnation elsewhere, quickly followed by the crisis of Greece, now into the fragmentation of the European Union. Now there's fear of double-dip recession. We have political discord and the unwillingness to trust elected governments to solve problems. That's where we are on the global scale. I was at the Keynesian Brazilian Association in September. People were really feeling pretty good. I was with Nelson Barbosa, Filho, and others, and Nelson, the number 2 in finance, in the Fazenda, he was talking with confidence about the coming growth of Brazil. And essentially my talk today is one giant warning, because the rest of the global economy really is not in that place. The causes of the crisis, very briefly, the strategic transformation of banking, essentially privileging rich people, upscale retail banking, expanding fringe banking, that is, money transfer and loan products that were aimed at the poor, at migrant workers, and at the socially excluded. This included predatory lending. Then the replacement of bank-centered lending by an originate and distribute model that required steady securitization financed by liquid assets in global markets. This, of course, was precisely the model that Northern Rock was doing. A second primary cause was the transformation of historical racial discrimination in banking. I talked a lot about that last time I was here, so I won't this time. And thirdly, the cross-border imbalance of the U.S., and specifically the fact that the U.S. economy has become a global liquidity sink. They could do the securitization, which requires offloading securities into a liquid market, money market, because the financial world is tilted toward the United States. So it's a strategy that goes along with what they've got. What happened? Here's a picture of the housing market, and the housing market tumbles. And one thing I would just note, these are some prices. There's the overall housing market as calculated by Case and Schiller. And notice that, here's the Midwest, which actually never really rises much. There's, barely 5% growth at best. Here are 2 representative western cities, growing rapidly and then tumbling rapidly. And basically, of the 20 cities that are captured in this index, what we see is an increasing standard deviation. In other words, increasing variety and experience. Space matters, and the diversity of the experience in foreclosures and housing crisis in the U.S. is part of the problem. There's not just one crisis, there are several. Last time we were here, we talked about how the commercial paper market had blown up. This is the market that had supported this is the asset-backed commercial paper market that had supported the securitized mortgages and other SIVs, and it simply collapsed, as you can see. The result was that the Federal Reserve took historically unprecedented actions to actually directly fund assets of the banks, to give them liquidity through the transfusion of blood, so to speak, in this case, the financial blood of money. We'll skip this one. This basically just shows you that this was happening in Europe. This is from Martin Wolf. In Europe, in UK, even more than in the US on a pro rata basis, the banks had severe meltdowns in their equity prices, and their marketization, their capitalizations went down tremendously. What happened in the U.S.? This is a picture that shows you the growth. We take the 25 largest banks in the United States from basically, here's the largest to the 25th largest. There are thousands actually, but these are the big ones. I then show how over time there's been growth, and almost all of the growth in the size has been at the top end. We've had the emergence of a few small, select mega banks that have become these large, complex financial organizations. Now, the last picture here is September 2008, or rather, June. What happened when the government stepped in? What was the impact of the interventions? Let's see. Keep your eyes kind of right here and watch. Check it out. The big got bigger. So this was too big to fail. And who got the federal bailout money? Same scale. That's who got the money. The missing places there are foreign-owned banks. Basically, the big boys got the big money. Meanwhile, lending was dropping. So I'm going to hurry through this one. And the bank failure rate is growing tremendously, although I want to point out for the record that we had another huge problem of bank failures in the 1980s around the savings and loan crisis. Basically, I think in the interest of time, I won't explain this very well. The point of this graph, this is California by county. What we have here is new foreclosures as a percentage of the homes sold. Basically, this goes to 100% over here. It's on the right scale. What we see is that there are counties where foreclosures are like 80% of the housing sales. In other words, there are as many people losing homes as there are getting new homes. And basically, this is a ranking of by that. And then this other scale, the blue, is average house price. The point here, and I'll just tell you what it is that essentially these bubbles here are the wealthy counties on the coast in the in California, the unaffordable housing. Now, where people had to live was basically in these places. So this is like San Francisco, Marin County. And these are the inland places where people went to live to find affordable houses. And you can see that these are the areas that are crashing. This is, in turn, Southern California. And this is inland Southern California. That's coastal Los Angeles and then inland. So essentially, this was a crisis born by the working class areas where people had desperately gone trying to find housing only to see it just collapse in value. Here's my slide from Andrew. Basically, what Andrew shows, in Andrew with his co-authors, Sean French and Nigel Thrift, is that the international financial centers, first of all, what were the origins of the crisis? And they've got 4 explanations. One is the behavior of the international financial centers, especially the competition between London and New York. I think this really has to be explored by us. Secondly, the insularity of the everyday geographies of money, the separation between the quasi-world, the imaginary world, but the real world of financialization and the actual real-time economies that these were affecting. Thirdly, as we note, the recycling of surpluses and deficits, and especially this link between China and the USA in terms of financial flows and trade flows. And finally, they point to the growing power of the financial media and the fact that there was this kind of transformation of what made sense and of what was rational. Okay, now let's go to some of the implications. Again, I'll try to be quick. But what we're going to do is tell 3 stories. The middle story is going to be really fast. But I want to focus on, first, the problem of governing power in finance. When we look at, you would think that you've got this failed banking sector, and you would think that it'd be pretty simple just to re-regulate banks to get them to limit their risks, renew growth of credit, and to shrink the size of these sectors. The Financial Times made it seem very easy in a recent graph, but reality is a lot more complicated. Here's the Financial Times graph. They say, okay, this is from their blog, the financial crisis in a picture. And what we see here is through time, the fact that this is the overall, this is GDP of the U.S. This is, in turn, profits, which kind of moves with GDP. And then here's the explosion of financial profits. You know, financialization. Okay, but how do we unpack that? Basically, the first problem we have, and the reason that I started doing work on power and finance, is that there's a denial that power has any significance in finance in the last 30 years of literature on the regulation of finance. This literature has been controlled by a group called the Shadow Financial Regulatory Committee. I was at the Brookings Institution in the 80s, briefly, and I worked there with when that group was founded, and they continue to operate as a central force, both in the research and in the policy areas. I won't go into it here, but essentially, the conclusions, they rely on efficient financial markets theory, and they have sponsored and collaborated in research that shows that more concentrated markets are more stable. Failures are due to moral hazard problems. So we always look for a moral hazard. But you know, what this overlooks is that concentration is power. And so this approach, as I tried to say in a paper I just finished, it hides power in plain sight. But we have lots of power. There's exit power, as we talked about, when one agent can leave and another can't. This was the case of those who were borrowers in the subprime market. They lacked power. There's private knowledge, the fact that a lot in these financial centers, there are many people that know things other people don't know. Goldman Sachs has gotten into big trouble for this. So that's a form of power. There's network power when we've restructured finance, and I'll show you in a minute, so that essentially you need access to the network to get a resource that you need. And thirdly, there's asymmetric resilience. That's when one agent can better suffer losses or renew themselves, and there's our too big to fail problem. Here's the strategic transformation of banking, and this originate and distribute credit model makes the mega banks dominant because they hold positional power. They have it at two choke points, where the link between the loan brokers and officers who are making the loans, and then in providing the markets for the securitized loans. I'll show you in a second how they're positioned. They can also then undergo arbitrage to make money. Essentially what's happened is that the old model looked like this. We had a bank that was a lender, that was with a borrower that could repay or default. There's our moral hazard. Here's the new system. You got this entire network, and I could have added more. And in this network, the bank is no longer actually even the lender, but the bank is in the key position between the chain that originates the mortgage, the chain that bundles, insures, and underwrites the mortgage, and the ultimate lenders. They're in the hub of everything, and we now depend on that network. Now, basically, I'm going to go quickly here through several pictures, essentially showing you, these pictures will show, and I'll make the slides available, that the big banks have taken advantage of this to really engage in super leveraging of derivatives. They've sold a lot of loans with recourse. They've gotten bigger compared to the market, and the big four in particular have gotten bigger. So those are just four pictures that show that. And essentially, though, power was very much present in subprime lending. They exploited exit power over the socially excluded borrowers. Private knowledge was used over uninformed people and over uninformed market participants. Network power was used in the control of access to the new form of mortgage markets. And then, of course, we had the too big to fail problem. So all these forms of power were operative and led to the survival of these giants when the Volcker Rule and other efforts argued that they should disappear. The problem here is there are several problems. One is that there's a kind of, why do we regulate? Well, we regulate in part to block market failures. One of the most important kinds of market failures is the tragedy of the commons problem that was identified by Ostrom, who won the most recent Nobel Prize in economics for talking about this. And I would argue that essentially what we have here is because the financial regulators didn't block the growing power in finance, these competing mega banks engaged in a tragedy of commons abuse of a very important public good resource in the financial sector, and I would argue that that is liquidity. The over-leveraging basically dried up the pool of liquidity and has now created fear in markets where we need confidence. Here's an example. This is just taken from Sunanda Sen, a Bank of India, calculated turnover in equities derivatives markets. The point here is just that these derivatives markets exploded and got way out of control. The problem then is that re-regulating the very mega banks that abuse this liquidity commons through super leverage are now at the core of the new credit system, and they've been found too big to fail. So attempts to reduce their leverage, reduce their risk-taking, reduce their exploitation and abuse of customers, these are underway now, both in the U.S. and in Eurozone countries, but it's a tough battle. How are we doing on time, Marco? I'm sorry? 10. Cool. Here's an example, and this goes to show you what happened with the mega banks. This is a picture of the seven largest, 7 largest banks as of the end of 2006. What happened? Now this is basically, so there's their size in 2006, 2007, 2008. Notice that Bank of America gets a lot bigger. How? Now this is September 2008. That's when the first actions were already happening. That's the end of September. Well, they took Merrill Lynch on board. They take Merrill Lynch, they get a lot bigger. How about J.P. Morgan Chase? They get bigger too. How? They took on Washington Mutual. Wells Fargo, which had a strategic problem because it wasn't quite too big to fail, what does it do? It takes over Wachovia Bank, which disappears, and it becomes one of the big four. We then have HSBC and Deutsche Bank, who were excluded from the bailout. They're foreign-owned banks. Now, let's see what happens next. We have a redefinition of what's a bank holding company. Who's added? Well, let's see. Here are the ones we had: Citigroup, Bank of America, J.P. Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, HSBC, Deutsche Bank. Oh, but look what we add. Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, MetLife, and Barclays Group. Now, we ask a very naive question. Are there any depositors that have deposits at these banks? No. And isn't that a problem when you're considered a bank holding company that's too big to fail and you're not even a bank? Well, Lloyd Blankfein and Goldman Sachs didn't think so, nor Morgan Stanley. They were quite happy to have the protection of the government against any threat of failure. In fact, now I've got, this is asset size here. So these are asset sizes. Check it out. Notice that, so they're just becoming bank holding companies. Now let's see what happens between March 09 and March 10. What I want you to look at here is each bank, and are they getting bigger or are they getting smaller? And the pattern is unclear. They are not so clearly deleveraging. Morgan Stanley's getting bigger, MetLife, Barclays, and so on. So, what we have here is the big are getting on with it. Okay, very briefly, the second theme, the problem of global growth. And I subtitled this, Are We Turning Japanese Before We Hit the Chinese Century? Well, of course, we all know that this is a century in which China will become the most important economy in terms of level of GDP. And China indeed was the first to recover, with East Asia and India as well. Brazil also did very well, as Nelson Barbosa mentioned at the Keynesian meeting. They had only one growth of 1 quarter of decline, then 4% growth, and now even 5.5% is forecast. And the U.S. economy as well is growing again slightly, with a severe problem of joblessness, as Jane mentioned as well for England. The Eurozone as a whole began to recover slightly. I was in Greece actually last February when it was declared that the Eurozone had recovered, and there in Greece we were actually still shrinking. And Germany and France in particular had decent recoveries, but now, as you know, Southern Europe is in decline. So how can you sustain this growth, especially if this outcry to cut fiscal deficits becomes dominant? Here's the problem. Two of the engines of world economic growth, Germany and China, are export-led with underdeveloped consumption. The other countries that have concentrated aggregate demand and really been the sources of the engines of spending power for the economy, are for the world economy, are now facing political and financial constraints to further stimulus. So essentially, many countries, including the United States, as Paul Krugman recently pointed out, look an awful lot like Japan in 1990. And Japan, as you know, remains a stagnant economy. So let's go on to the last theme. We need Keynesian stimulus, but basically, and we need growth, we need long-term investment. But I would argue that the ability of government authorities to do this is blocked because we are in transition from a neoliberal world to something that's not yet born. Chinua Achebe, the great Ghana, novelist from Ghana, had a novel called The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, and we are in that situation. Basically, these initiatives are blocked or undermined. They're blocked or undermined by regional compacts and essentially neoliberal mechanism designs that were put in place by countries in the neoliberal era in order to protect themselves from the race to the bottom that was part of the neoliberal story. So, you have regional compacts that are based on the rules of a neoliberal world with mobile capital that's unregulated, and it's undermined because many market practices are based on arbitrage. These reward speculation and exploitation, and these are going to be undermining efforts at longer-term reform. So we have this kind of perverse interaction between regional coordination mechanisms and market incentives. Regional coordination mechanisms, and by this I mean like the Eurozone, are designed so that governments without discipline will be punished and should be punished by mobile capital and dog-eat-dog trade regimes. This is so deeply understood that we don't even need the IMF anymore. Governments do this on their own. National policies are based on the premise that attractive fiscal and monetary conditions will attract buyers of good and investors of capital. This is what Clinton did. This is what Blair did. The first Lula regime, you remember, Pelosi. The Obama has gone this way. What about Brown? And just to take a look at some of these things, just kind of mention the Eurozone, rules about fiscal discipline, is restraining effective Keynesian policies. The Euro area makes less robust economies like Greece dependent on stimulus by stronger ones. And so that's a problem there. We have NAFTA in the United States, and I won't mention much about that because we're not in Mexico and interested so much in that problem here. But essentially, cross-border movements of labor have become embedded in the macro imbalances. Up to 10% of the adult population of Mexico now lives in the United States. And there's this diminished government capacity to provide safety net support for redundant workers and an anti-immigrant resentment. You might have seen where Obama was fiercely challenged by a congressman who was bold enough to say, "You lie," when he addressed the nation with his State of the Economy speech, and that "you lie" was precisely about immigration. Okay, so basically, there's a kind of focus on arbitrage as a way to make money. And I'll skip over this, just to say that this idea of arbitrage is deeply embedded. It used to be restricted to financial markets, and the idea was that you could exploit implicit price differences that appeared momentarily. It was completely safe, and you could just lock in a profit by taking advantage of differences in price. It was riskless and kept the markets honest. That's what we all learned in grad school. This was restricted to financial markets, but no longer. Arbitrage, it now takes place across time, in production, in finance. It involves the mobility of production, the arbitrage through time, which is one way of thinking about asset acquisition, supported by securitization, especially the home purchase thing. You arbitrage your income through time with payday loans. And the idea is that you take a risk because you have to, or you might make money from it. But there are many spillovers from this. You have the breakage of linkages and the dependence of commitments made at one point in time on other points in time. And this locks things together in ways that are often predatory. So, with the payday lending, we have unequal market power. We have the extraction of short-term gains. This is part of the explosion of riches on Wall Street and the growing inequality. And basically, these strategies depend on structural disequilibria. So we have a very uneven map of winners and losers from global competition that's, part of the story and part of now what must be broken. And indeed, these strategies are optimized on a set of global conditions that no longer exist. So, let me just say, let's go through, let me abuse your eyes, I'll skip through there. And just to say that central banking is an example of a problem, that we don't have something strong enough to force everybody to play by one set of rules so that we can insert long-term growth phenomenon and defeat speculators. Nobody's exactly in charge and able to discipline and underwrite the system. So the dynamics that were embedded in the neoliberal world are still at work, and it's this fear that's undermining the efforts to rescue Europe. And frankly, I don't see how the Eurozone will be rescued, and if that is where unless we see the Prime Minister there have a true transformation of her character and her mind. But that means that this crisis of Greece and Portugal, Italy, Spain, the pigs' economies, this is a problem because Germany's growth, and Merkel knows this, is based on systematic export surplus. So, the pigs cannot grow their way out of recession, these southern countries. They're all in the Eurozone. They can only do it by cutting wages. And if you cut wages, your population will hit the streets, as has happened in Greece. And this undermines the legitimacy of governments exactly when we need government leadership to get us out of this crisis. So the Eurozone was designed as a way of capturing zero-sum gains from the rest of the world. It now imposes zero-sum losses on its own members. It's a failed experiment. To conclude, where does this leave Brazil? I see 3 and maybe 4 futures. One question to consider is Brazil, think about what China did. China pulled itself. Why? Because if you've been to China, you know. China is all about their market. They let people in, they take technology, they then reproduce the technology, perfect it, manufacture it, and sell to their home market. That is how they're growing. Pronto. They then take the money, they get from the rest of the world the resources they need, and that's it. That's the model. Basically, can Brazil be a China? Is the market here big enough with 185 million brasileiros that we can have self-sustaining Keynesian growth in this country? I wonder. I don't think so. But somebody better be modeling that. The second possibility is something like the kind of growth we've seen, frankly. What saved Lula's first administration when they were having that year of recession? If you remember, they sold soja and other resources to China and elsewhere. It was essentially resource extraction that saved the Brazilian economy. Now, we could continue that, because one thing that you need to know about China is that China is not interested in sharing. China will not avoid developing its own Embraer to build the planes that it wants to have in its own markets. It will build its own planes. And if I'm not mistaken, Embraer has a subcontract now in China where they're negotiating the terms of technology transfer to build the Embraer-like jets. Don't think that the Chinese will make sure that there's Embraer and Brazilian labor in every jet that ever flies in China. They don't care. They are about keeping Chinese people off the streets, increasing the growth of the very thin, still middle class in China, and maintaining Communist Party control. Period. That's what that place is about. So you can kind of fit into that scheme. That's not a real happy picture. Oops. The third possibility is that we have an overheating, a housing bubble crash in selected large cities, formal zones, and then renewed stagnation with danger of capital flight. Now here's the fourth possibility, right? Green high-tech development and growth based on widespread innovation and growing prosperity. Is this on the agenda? I know that here at UFMJ and CEDEPLAR there's a lot of, and even earlier today in this room, there was some very important ideas expressed about the need for high-tech growth, for innovation, and for encouraging small and medium enterprises to grow, for encouraging innovation and development. And that's kind of the way we want to see things move in Brazil. We want to see the sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters of miners move to the high-tech sector sustainably, not in a bubble. But we need to find the pathway to get there, and it has to be coordinated with national policies. And unfortunately, if we go back to those cycles and circles, that's going to have to be coordinated with the broader fate of the world economy, which now is very, very dim indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary. Para finalizar, agora gostaria de agradecer a participação. Nós trazemos um pouquinho, mas não tanto. Tá ok, gente? Só um aviso, gente. Vai ter uma mesa na quinta-feira, financiamento imobiliário e exclusão, na qual nós três estamos fazendo parte. Nós estamos fazendo uma pequena revolução e nós vamos mudar o tema da palestra. Nós combinamos aqui, tivemos a acordância da direção, para explorar um pouquinho mais algumas coisas novas que não existem aqui. Por exemplo, a Jane vai falar sobre financiamento muçulmano. Ela está estudando bancos muçulmanos, o que é uma coisa um pouco diferente, porque a religião se interage com finanças. Então, nós vamos aproveitar a presença dela para explorar um pouco isso. Eu vou falar sobre estrutura e hierarquia financeira no Brasil. O Gary vai falar sobre... O que foi mesmo, Gary, que nós combinamos? Vai tentar...
What I think I'm going to do is the rethinking Minsky in the context of the current financial crisis.
Ok. Vai ser uma sessão mais de tópicos, porque o interessado principal no tema era o Leishon, ele não veio, a ideia era com ele a gente montar uma rede de pesquisa, então nós fizemos uma pequena revolução aqui com autorização da organização. Obrigado, gente. Então, 2h30 a gente começa de novo.